a slight fraud in the sense in addressing something in the session about not agreement, because what I want to do is to talk entirely about non-monetary policy issues. You'll see why. Anyway, my question, what I'm considering is the early years of the Thatcher government, did they change history, and if so, for how long? Now, my answer is that they undoubtedly did, but is important. When the government came in 79, they had a very clearly stated set of objectives which will be all familiar to you, but I'm going to run through them fast. Permanent reversal of the country's long-run economic decline, re-establishment of conditions for sustainable economic growth by conquering inflation, introducing monetary discipline, reducing the burdens on industry by scrapping controls, curbing public spending, restoring incentives. You'll all be familiar with that. These were a pretty clear call to the country to change its many policies and institutions, and certainly a challenge to many long-run attitudes. In thinking about this, I find it helpful really to divide the actions of the government into three categories. First of all, the short run. I'm thinking of really Marshallian cost curves here. Short run, and then the medium run, and then finally the long run, sustaining long-run sustainable growth. As I say, I'm not going to talk about monetary policy or any European issues. My views on the monetary policy slide have been set out in my article for Duncan Needham's excellent and exciting book, Contraction and Fiscal Expansion, which I hope you've all had. Now, let me take phase one, halting the decline, 79 to 81, short run. That was manifestly a period in which one reached a watershed at or shortly after the 1981 budget. And that was a very important moment. I won't go into the details, you will all be familiar with. But what, in my view, it did is quite an important and broad range of achievements. First of all, it ended more or less 2 years of anxiety about whether the government could survive at all. Would there be a U-turn? It entrenched for the first time for many years in what I then thought of and still describe today as the soft centre of the British body politic, a wide range of hard budget constraints. And this is far more than just monetary control. It celebrated the importance of setting out a coherent framework for fiscal policy, monetary policy, and much else in the form of the MTFS. It institutionalised something that people weren't very commonly thinking about, the importance of money, credit, the banking system, and capital markets. And certainly it pushed much of the responsibility for employment and unemployment levels back onto employers, workers, and unions, rather than accepting it all for the state. Now, as well as all those short-run budgetary measures, those first 2 or 3 years saw some important structural reforms. Things like the unions, things like the abolition of exchange controls, and there were more. But perhaps the most important point about that period was as the last year approached, 1982 through 83, the government sensed a great change in public support. There were the Falklands campaign and other related benefits to its image. Journalists began suddenly to change their tone. I found that very interesting, as Special Advisor T. Jeffrey Hurd. The Wets began to wonder whether they were really so justified, and so on and so forth. And so we were able to move quite quickly into a second phase, which one might call resuming proper, healthy growth, at least over a reasonable medium term, like one economic cycle. Now, these tables that I've asked you all to look at, or I'm asking you to look at now, are not very exciting objects, but they are there to make a very simple fundamental point. The reality behind what these tables point to was remarkable. The government's programme extended all over the place, all round the supply side, all round the microeconomy. Very few people appreciate how much it is doing, and very few macroeconomists in particular have bothered to pay any attention to it. It's a very, very important point. It's extremely boring to write it up. If you go back and look through Conservative Party propaganda, which is a lot of very good and objective history, you'll find it listed page after page after page. Now, this excellent set of measures carried through, one way or another, to 1987. And you had, during that period, pretty much a strong majority, a reasonably well-united government, a very lively and creative debate, some strong ministers, and coherent government processes. Now, all of that, though, sets the stage for the third part of the period, which is 1987 and afterwards. Now, at that point, I would argue that were one to have expected the process of, if you like, reconstruction and reform to get really entrenched, we needed to have another round of fairly major and radical changes. That would have brought us into a kind of virtuous circle German world. But it was then that the gleaming record began to get a bit tarnished. Now, there are some pretty obvious reasons why it became tarnished, but let me just turn to the 6 major areas that mattered if we were looking ahead. First of all, public spending. Public spending was dealt with very efficiently in the short term, in 1979 to 81. If anybody remembers back to 1979, it was extremely worrying and extremely chaotic and extremely disorderly, made more difficult by the fact that there was a strike and no one knew what was happening either to public expenditure or to the monetary aggregates. But the biggest issue was not control. It was the much more fundamental one that we're now fairly familiar with. Big growing backlog of infrastructure, lots of demographic problems boiling up, ratio of workers to dependents getting more difficult, more old than young, and so on and so forth. More demand on social services, you know it. And it did not take a genius to see if those processes were going to continue with a relatively average GDP growth, we were going to get into great difficulties. And we had to start thinking about it. And as the period of self-confidence at the end of the 1979 to 83 process built up, ministers thought they at last could begin to address these questions, and they did it by asking the Rothschild think tank, the CPRS, Central Policy Review Staff, in the summer of 82, to look at the problem of delivering public services in the longer term and possible imaginative ways around them. This was called the Long-Term Public Expenditure, or LTPE exercise for the historians. Geoffrey Howe describes in his memoirs what a catastrophe this was. It went badly off the rails, first of all, when an early draft of the work was leaked, I think The Economist, doesn't really matter which, and then we had to hurriedly put a paper to the Cabinet shortly after the summer holiday, and the Cabinet turned up their noses in disgust. And that was all going on in the midst of major public controversy. The only thing that saved us was that Michael Foot was becoming more and more prominent as leader of the Labour Party, helped put these relatively serious questions into a kind of, into the shade, should we say. Anyway, the consequences, whatever may have been happening to Michael Foot, the consequences were very, very serious in my view. The first thing is that ministers said, Conservative ministers, we simply cannot discuss all these delicate issues in private anymore. We cannot trust our officials. This leaking system makes it impossible, particularly without the support of a responsible press. And then the next thing was that we went on to say, if you go on and look at the behaviour of the CPRS, that's no good. In the 1983 election, all this material was recycled. No one in the press noticed it had been produced 9 months earlier. And I remember a terribly fraught press conference with Mrs. Thatcher and Cecil Parkinson, after which we sat down for the usual mulling it over, and they said, we can't have this organisation anymore. We cannot discuss serious long-term issues that are as controversial as this. And they abolished the CPRS. And in so doing, they removed a major instrument for policy analysis and speculation in the longer term. But there was some benefit from all this. I'll just note in parenthesis, and that arises over the pensions debate. The pensions debate was important because the Labour Party had introduced an earnings-related pension scheme under Barbara Castle in 1975, and it had 2 pernicious features. One was intrinsic, which was it had double indexation, so that the rate of the pension was indexed to whichever grew faster, prices or earnings, and that gave you an automatic and potentially long-run lethal ratchet effect. So that had to be tackled. The second problem was it had no serious earnings related. We had no serious earnings related element in our pensions previously. Barbara Castle introduced one. When you did the arithmetic more than 2 years out, you discovered it was, again, quite unrealistic and hopeless. So, as a result of those perceptions, arising partly from the LTPE work, we were able to at least move away from the double indexation completely, which is now being restored, I may say, and have a proper, sensible second-tier system of private pensions, which became variously ABCs or SIPs or restaurants, which is, of course, very much at the discretion of the individual. If that sensible discussion had been possible in other areas, it might have made an enormous difference. But, of course, there were other reasons why it wasn't possible to go on having it, and that brings one back to the politics, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute. Now, another area that was very delicate was taxation. We started off with a simple idea: let's try and cut taxes in some sense to improve incentives. But we very quickly moved on beyond that to the simple perception that the political process naturally elaborates and develops more and more pustules, special provisions, exceptions, whatever you may like to think of, in any serious piece of onerous tax legislation. It's intrinsic to the political process. Almost all chancellors like to buy favours, grant favours, buy peace, attract praise, and mitigate judiciously where the shoe is pinching most. So the simplest thing to do, therefore, was to clear the whole lot away and have a much lower rate. Every one of those things has a cost, and that, of course, was the underlying perception behind the 1984 corporate tax reform, which is one of the most fundamental reforms I've ever come across anywhere. Another perception, we started trying to find ways of simplifying and lightening the burden of some of the less sensible regulations. It turns out to be very, very difficult. Once you've got something implanted, and you then start trying to remove something or improve it, again the interest groups arise. The obvious thing to do is simply junk the measures. So we decided that it's very important to scrap a tax every year. And that was a very fundamental principle of conservative tax policy for a good many years. Unfortunately, there came a different era in which Kenneth Clarke reversed the process and we introduced the insurance tax. And at that moment, I knew that the getting of wisdom was well and truly ended. Another very important thing was the simple perception that it's extremely difficult to justify having lots and lots of different tax rates for different classes of investment expenditure, savings, income, you name it. Why should they be different? So there's a natural tendency that we were discussing in private to try and equalize as many tax rates as you could. And that leads you very quickly into a separate but very important discussion of fiscal neutrality. And lurking in the background, I may say, was some very important external work from Mervyn King and John Kay. It's very important that I should say that, because this is one of the benefits of having a stable, well-organized government that's willing to listen to good outside advice and analysis. And the last thing that people saw in the tax area was the great importance of integrating social security and taxation. That went back to the perceptions of the Barber regime and to the work of Arthur Cofield. And lots of work was undertaken to bring about a good system of tax credits. You may say, we seem to be still trying to do it now, but that's a different point. It was interesting. And there was even an outbreak of real theoretical rigor when my cousin Ridley introduced an indexed capital gains tax. That didn't last long. People said it's far too complex. Anyway, you'll find this adventurous record is summarized in the third table in your handout. But one thing did go very badly wrong, and that was when Mrs. Thatcher and others decided to introduce a community charge, or poll tax, call it what you like, which was both an economic disaster and a political one. And it was even more of a political one because it was allied with squabbles with Geoffrey Howard and Nigel Lawson that led to her final ending as the party's leader. Now, another area that was very important was local authorities. The mistaken introduction of the community charge was part of the problem, if you like, the problem of local government, that there wasn't a sensible way of raising revenue in local government. Now, local government had been already reformed only a decade earlier. I think it was the ward reforms, it doesn't really matter. But during the middle 70s, many will remember that there were a series of things that caused difficulties. There were people who overspent, there were people who refused to put up their rates or to collect the rates that were due. There was a very aggressive left-wing council or two here and there, and individuals like Derek Hatton, Kenny Livingston, and the rest were very much, and Ted Knight were very much in the public eye. This induced ministers to go for more controls and tougher controls, some of which are listed in these tables, which was understandable at that time, but completely contrary to conservative thinking, completely contrary, indeed, I would say, to any kind of liberal, central view and belief in a pluralist, open economy. And we are now watching the consequences of this 20 or 30 years of extreme centralisation, which is greater than in any other European economy, I believe. And it's not surprising to see ministers grasping at expedients like appointing supermayors or whatever it may be. And we are not in the least surprised, in my case, to read that there's a great sense of impotence and alienation, even in prosperous areas, let alone in the less prosperous ones. Then there's financial regulation. Anybody who thinks back to the 80s will recall there was an explosion of innovation and all sorts of changes, some of which are listed in the table here. Table 7. This explosion, of course, had to go hand in hand with the promotion of important new objectives of policy like wider share ownership, less institutional dominance of investment, more housing, wider ownership. We hoped for a massive increase in the banking services, uptake of banking services by the general population. Now, a lot of work went into developing the regulatory framework. There was the distinguished Professor Gower, whom some of us will remember, who used to toil year after year in a slightly distant way, and one occasionally heard faint whispers from Fred Needlestreet, who was obviously a group of people in the bank who were thinking about regulation. But it has to be said that the government ran very, very fast and got very out of breath at a time when it had unleashed a series of changes which it simply had not got the measure of. It produced the first bad result in what I think is one of the worst pieces of legislation I can recall in the regulatory area, the 1986 Financial Services Act. And I remember Charles and I going to various meetings together, and possibly both sighed the heavy sigh, and we saw and watched what was coming. And what was coming was a whole succession of crises. Just think about it: BCCI, Johnson Matthey, the International Tin Council, London Metal Exchange, the property crash of the early 90s that didn't quite happen. You could go on and on. And there were consumer scandals as well. Now, I think in retrospect that we went too far, and we had far too little knowledge and far too little work on the regulatory framework. And if we were in that position, it's really rather sad, because of all the countries in Europe, the one that should have been able to muster the best efforts should surely have been us. And I think that the process went on in a bad way right the way through the 1997 Financial Services and Markets Act, and it's still a problem for the government today. We haven't been able to get a good regulatory framework going, and we could and should have done. I'm getting near the end now, but there's a something I haven't heard talked about much, and it was interesting, it was never talked about much: competition policy. You would have thought that a right-wing government dedicated to a liberal, decentralised market economy would be very worried about competition policy. In the Conservative Research Department, I organised some work on this, and the shadow cabinet before the 1979 election tried to suppress it. Very interestingly, under the leadership of Lord Thornycroft, who was a senior member of the board of Pirelli, a very large Italian oligopolist in the electrical supply sector. Happily, we got it back, and the 1980 Competition Act was quite good. And thereafter, there was quite a promising series of initiatives in the early days of the 1979-83 government. Nationalised industries could be referred to the Monopolies Commission, and at that point, there began a hunt for the professional monopolies. And Ken Clark, in particular, has a glorious record. If we put all the heads on the wall, there's opticians, solicitors, barristers, prison officers, and on and on. He chased a whole lot, and he destroyed more or less the monopoly powers that they had been enjoying. But, what was going on in other areas? Mergers and the rest. The story from the middle, certainly from the middle 90s onwards, is one of almost endless merger after merger after merger. Merger of the privatised utilities, mergers of the banking system. Regulators saying, it's, well, if they're in difficulties, they said this at the bottom of the cycle, we can always merge them with someone else, and that'll take the trouble off our hands and probably solve the problem of finding extra capital. And thus it's ever been. So much so that the recent Director General of the CMA, and I wonder if any of you know, how many people here know who John Fingleton is? Well, that's a few. Let me make the point, though, it is one of the most important positions in the British economy, held by a very distinguished economist, and most people don't even know his name. And how many of you knew that he was in charge of the CMA? Hands up. 1, 2, 3. I rest my case, my love. Anyway, that has been a sad retreat, though, because during the period we're talking about, there were some very distinguished economists hard at work on the regulatory framework, often feeding off or feeding into the privatisation process. People like Beazley, Littlechild, latterly Ian Byatt. I could go on. But there's not much of that going on now, as I've noticed. And no one seems to be interested in it. And yet, outside you find there is a serious international competition policy being pursued, and I'm going to ask someone to say where they think it's being initiated.
Brussels.
Thank you very much, sir. And I think that's a really rather sad picture. And the question one ought to ask oneself, even in a non-partisan context, let alone in a partisan one, is what are the necessary conditions that have to be satisfied to have a really successful, long-run process of reform and improvement that lasts not 10 months or 5 years, but 15 or 20. And if you look at the way the government was able to work and consult in the period of 79 to 87, you have some pretty strong points. And today there's very little likelihood of any of that being repeated, as far as I can see. Anyway, on that depressing note, I thank you all, but I urge you to look at these measures. Just look at these measures and ask yourselves whether there's anything remotely like it that you can think of in recent British history, because this is but a selection of the things that the government were doing. There was an enormous array of supply-side reform, and I come back to the point, this is more important in many ways than the monetary policy. More important by far. Because I think basically once the MTFS was, and all that went with it, was turning into this much wider picture that I painted at the beginning, after the 1981 budget, it was the hard budget constraint and the union reforms that mattered. Just a little joke in parenthesis, you all remember the 364 economists. Some of you will know that the progenitor of that was Robert Neild. Robert Neild wrote a very interesting article that Duncan and I dug around with a bit a little while ago. He wrote it as an Economic Journal newsletter, comment on his activities in promoting and organising the 364. He said, of course, actually, I didn't really agree with everything she did. I mean, quite right to bash the unions, quite right to have a really deflationary budget. The trouble was I just couldn't bear her. She was so loathsome.